repatriation of cultural artifacts, cultural heritage, seems to be today one of the most important competition all over the world. Things are changing sharply, and when we started here in Italy with a tough application of UNESCO 1970 convention and Italian provision of our end of 30s laws about cultural heritage, it seemed to be something very distant from common sense, seemed to be somehow a patriotic, if not nationalistic approach. It was not. It was a political strategy related to an Italian approach, an Italian culture, sensitivity, strictly linked to a long, long history of culture crossing, starting from the celebrated Grecia capta ferum victorem cepit, meaning that we loved to be crossed by other culture and to assume from others' culture changes since the Roman era, then the modern times, Renaissance, until contemporary times, that Italian culture was something more universal than patriotic. At the same time, Italy should have been part of such a strategy because we were harmed for such a long while by cultural sacking, cultural heritage theft along the centuries. As you perfectly know, most of international, universal museums in the world are made of Italian culture heritage. So anyway, the history of creating an universal museum and a national, under a national purpose, through encyclopedic museums, allowed to sack and theft of cultural heritages. Canova was asked by the Pope to go to the Louvre, to go to Paris, to pick up back some of the dozen or hundreds of masterpieces that Napoleon brought to Paris through his Italian campaigns. Today, the universal point of view shows something very different. The heritage is universal. At the same time, it's a patrimonio dell'umanità. At the very same time, it belongs to a country. But for instance, when my great-grandfather was called to give back to France Mona Lisa, Ottavio Marini was Director General Italian Beaux-Arts, Belle Arti. It was a very tough choice, but it was undoubtedly due to the Louvre, this restitution, because Leonardo da Vinci went to France with La Gioconda and sold it to the French king. So my great-grandfather and other Italian public servants had to decide this restitution, even if in the country there was a popular movement asking not to give it back after it was stolen by a crazy Italian in the Louvre in the night time. So after 1970, all has changed, and everybody knows that restitution of cultural heritage to the countries that have to own that heritage is an international duty, and it has to be enforced. Of course, it has to be enforced through negotiation, through legal battles, through diplomatic actions, also very tough conversation, as it happened to me when I was Minister of Culture of Italy, 2006, 2008, and I opened a controversial debate with Getty Museum in Malibu, Los Angeles. We demonstrated that dozens of very important artifacts were stolen, had been stolen in Italy, and illegally trafficked in order to end in Getty Museum in Malibu. We demonstrated that through the work of our lawyers, archaeologists, carabinieri of the cultural heritage preservation, through our functionaries, our officials, and it was very easy to demonstrate from where those masterpieces came. I had to fight, but at the very end, it was not a national victory. The fact that those masterpieces, among them the Morgantina goddess coming from Sicily, or other very important works of art that were in other museums, like the Metropolitan Museum or the Boston Fine Arts Museum, from where I picked up the Vibia Sabina portrait. The statue referred to the wife of the Emperor Hadrian. Vibia Sabina is another very important masterpiece. We gave back as a loan to the Boston Fine Arts Museum a beautiful statue of Eirene, just discovered in Palombara Sabina, close to Rome. Like this original statue came from Tivoli, very, very likely, and now it is in Tivoli, Villa Adriana. She came back home. It was a fight? No, it was a cooperation. After, of course, displaying determination for obtaining back what belongs to my country. But Italy was credible in that action because my country gave back not necessarily due to a juridical obligation, very important works of art and history, for instance, the Axum obelisk, given because it was a colonial appropriation to Ethiopia, or the Venere di Cirene. I signed the authorization to give it back not to a perfect democratic country, Libya, not to a perfect democratic leader, Gaddafi, but it was necessary, appropriated, and correct. The same happened with other statues we gave back, for instance, to Albania, also linked to some colonial Italian exploitations. During the exhibition in Colosseo, end of 2016, we displayed two busts coming from Palmyra. They were nearly destroyed, severely damaged during the Daesh attack in the heart of this fantastic civilization. We received them from Syria through the Italian embassy in Beirut. It was very complicated in terms of diplomacy due to the lack of diplomatic cooperation between the countries. But we had a very positive agreement, and the agreement was that in the Istituto Centrale per il Restauro, ISCR, here in Italy, in Rome, these two masterpieces, also honoring Khaled al-Assad, the martyr for the protection of Syrian heritage, they would have been restored. It happened, and at the very beginning of 2017, we could give back to Syria. I think it's the only case when two important sculptures were exfiltrated from Syria legally and could come back to Syria legally through this bilateral cooperation, scientific cooperation, something resonating with our hearts and minds, with the two people, mutual understanding and respect. They are now back in their museum, the very place where they were nearly destroyed. They have been restored by Italian restorators, by Italian scholars, and it's a real good reason for joy, pride, and something very well representing what should be, what should always be cooperation on cultural heritage. So every time in Italy we find works that has been trafficked, stolen, we are able to give it back to the right country. Under my administration, we did that. We did it with Iran, with Pakistan, with other Latin American countries, with dozens or hundreds of artifacts. So Italy has a cultural diplomacy that is perfectly aware of history. We do not want to dismantle the encyclopedic museum, but we perfectly know that many, many museums in the world must give back and create cultural cooperation with many countries in the world. I know I'm talking about something that is uncomfortable, but when we talk about fantastic new museums like Humboldt in Berlin or Musée des Quai Branly at Paris, we talk about museums largely made by works anthropologic, ethnographic, historic, symbolic works coming from countries where they have been stolen through colonial appropriation. That has to change, and I think that is also a very good occasion to open a new concept of museum today that would bring us too far away, but it's a very important issue. We have to build new museums in the world, not based on our Western or European, Eurocentric vision, but I think much more linked to a universal vision, able to explain also the horrifying events. For instance, traffico di schiavi, trafficking slaves, using the power to make something like in Benin happened the Benin bronzes are the fruit of an awful, awful appropriation. And even if the UNESCO convention didn't exist, of course, it was more than 100 years before it entered to force, some restitutions must be made, and a stricter cooperation between among international cultural institutions, governments, scholars is absolutely indispensable, because a new concept on owning cultural property and displaying it to benefiting public opinion, young generation, and a new approach that is not anymore our Western-centric point of view must be done. So the Italian approach about reappropriation and restitution, the Italian approach about the universal value of cultural heritage, I think is not the one in the world, but I think it's very important, because we displayed our engagement, our vision, and something that has been shared not only by one minister or another, one institution or a carabinieri force for a specific period of time. No, that has been a shared Italian point of view in the universal international community. And I think your Venice event is very important to create some further steps in the direction of cooperation, a common approach, and dismantling the point of view that something belongs to me, meaning one state, one country, that has to be shared much more, also through digital technology, through loans, but at the very first point, there is the international legality, respect of international law that today is mandatory for preserving cultural heritage.